Okay, let's get going. I I don't want to waste any of our precious time because we have a very enormous and significant topic to to contend with here, and three really interesting, well-informed people. It's my privilege to chair this because I'm quite good friends with all three of these people, and I've had many hours of fascinating and transforming conversations with them. And I think getting them together is like multiplying the effect. What I have in mind today is to admonish each of them to keep their remarks truly to close to 15 minutes at the longest. And if it goes much longer than that, I want everybody out there to start hissing, okay? Uh, and because what I really would like to see is some dialogue between them. And so maybe at the end we'll have a couple of questions, but I think we could get some great richness out of back and forth right here. I'm listed on I'm Bill Hurlbut, by the way, from Stanford. I teach in the Department of Neurobiology, and I teach courses in ethics, technology, and medicine. But I'm listed sort of co-equal, but I'm not going to say much except probe and add comments and wherever I think there's a joke. But our topic is creation or coincidence? Is there a cosmic plan? So you've all heard that famous quote from Jacques Monod: "Man at last knows he is alone in the unfeeling immensity of the universe, out of which he has emerged only by chance." Wow, what a saying, what a statement. What was his life like? You know, when you think back on the 20th century especially, it was a time where that kind of thought was so prevalent. And I think it's echoing in some ways digging in deeper in the 21st century. But even in the 20th century, there was so much confusion over where we'd come from, how we'd arisen, and what we're for as individuals and collectively as societies and as a species. When you think about the major conflicts of the 20th century, they were, at least in some ways, ideologically fought over biological ideology. The Nazis with their deterministic eugenic perspectives, the communists with their notion that it was all just class warfare, that human beings were capable of unlimited, individually even, capable of unlimited opportunity. And these kind of ideological interpretations of our source and significance are echoing into the modern age. Obviously, evolutionary psychology has both informed our thinking, but also created some pernicious implications that are being played out. I mean, when the Time magazine came out with the cover that said, it showed a broken wedding ring, and it said, "Infidelity, it may be in your genes." And I just thought, well, that's not exactly the support for the person who's struggling in their marriage or trying to live a good life. It's giving permission. There's a pessimism that can creep in with our interpretations. And yet we're gathered here in this university that's centered around what could be called a mythopoetic understanding that Simon so beautifully lays out. I am the Alpha and the Omega. This is the subject we're on. We have three speakers who will give sequential statements, and then we're going to dialogue. First, we're going to hear from Simon, who you all heard last night, so I don't need to really introduce him again. Oxford University paleobiologist. I mean, sorry, the other one, the better one, Cambridge. The second speaker is Jeffrey Schloss. He's the T.B. Walker Chair of Natural and Behavioral Sciences at Westmont College in Santa Barbara, California. And the third speaker is Terence Deacon, who is an anthropologist, but a physical anthropologist and very broadly based scholar who's had interesting inquiries into evolution as well as cognitive science in his background through Harvard, Boston College, and currently at University of California, Berkeley. So that's enough introduction. Let's get going.
Shall I stand up here? We'll do this mic here.
What did you say?
Shall I stand up there or use
Yes,
the mic?
stand up here. That's more authority.
Oh, yes, that's right. Right, well, thank you. We'll just do a roll call. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bill. I will be as brief as I can because I'm aware that I think most people, I won't ask for a show of hands, who wasn't at my lecture? I'll try and give a tiny bit of context, and I'm certainly not going to address directly the possibility of telos or purpose, although it may well be implicit in a few of the things that I say. And last night, very briefly, I alluded to the phenomenon of evolutionary convergence, which is, as I've said to a number of people chatting here and elsewhere, is now becoming far too popular. So I'm going to leave that to other people to work on for the foreseeable future. But the point about convergence is that there's something of a contrast with the one and only figure in The Origin of Species by our friend Darwin, which of course shows classically this diversification. And I think it's not coincidental that Darwin himself is not especially interested in convergence. He really makes quite, he only makes passing reference, and in point of his arch nemesis, Mivart, St. John Mivart, actually dwelt on convergence to some considerable extent, and in doing so managed to irritate Darwin in a way which you wouldn't believe for such a gentle man, and that's another story perhaps. But the point, therefore, is that we have this ever-radiating set of species which are filling the biosphere more and more completely, if you like, and yet on the other hand we have what appears to be ubiquitous convergence. So how do we reconcile these two to start with? I think there are possibly two ways we can think about this. The one is, of course, that to use a simple quotation from an abstract which dealt with the fascinating subject of the jaw structure of the labrid fish, and most of you will know this paper, I understand. But in point of fact, as they point out, divergence is local, but convergence is global. So in any one particular clade, they will go in all sorts of places, but on the grand scheme of things, they'll actually turn out to be pretty well convergent. So the other aspect, which I didn't dwell on, I think, is that if you look at the combinatorial immensity of biological forms, the sort of numbers which the astronomers deal with, bless them. Actually, I have to say, I take my hat off to astronomers every day because, you know, they're really making amazing progress. I mean, what other group has managed to lose 80% of the visible universe in just a few years? That's, you know, crackingly good. But the combinatorial immensity of all biological alternatives is much, much larger. They're the so-called immense numbers, Alsacer and others are referred to, 10 to 250. They're stupidly big numbers. And convergence, at least on this planet, would suggest that the number of solutions is an infinitesimally small fraction of that gigantic number, maybe in the order of, on average, 10 to the 3, 10 to the 4, no more than that. So this suggests that almost all of theoretical morphospace is permanently unoccupiable and probably permanently uninhabitable. So in that way, convergence might hint at an underlying structure, and I wouldn't want to use words like predetermined, but in any event, is an indication that beneath the obvious organismal and molecular complexity, there are other rules of organization, and physicists and chemists will understand in part where one might come from in that regard. And the other thing I mentioned very briefly is that mass extinctions, which of course take central part in any first year course because they're so exciting to teach, and a number of scientific approaches, you resolve what actually happened on some ghastly day near Mexico, Shishilub in the end Cretaceous, for example. But actually, as I hinted, mass extinctions are creative. They accelerate what's going to happen. In any case, and just to amplify that very slightly, my reading of this is that, in fact, the chaps who are going to take over, and chapesses, I'm so sorry, who are going to take over the world are already in moving towards pole position. So in the time of the dinosaurs, the mammals are already diversifying. All that happens is when the asteroid and the Deccan volcanic eruptions coincide, interestingly, this gives them a golden opportunity, which effectively allows us to move the evolutionary schedule ahead by 50 million years. So we just doff our hats. It's very helpful indeed. So that may be, again, another sort of indication that rather than being randomly sending the courses of evolution in all sorts of unexpected directions, as has been almost universally argued on the basis of the mass extinctions ecologically resetting agendas, may suggest again, simply because our major players are already in position, that, as I've mentioned, they're creative. Now, just almost to conclude, I also drew attention to the possibility that the gulf between ourselves and animals is much wider and deeper and puzzling than is generally accepted in today's societies. Nothing wrong with that. We can all be wrong. I refer to myself, of course. But one book which I found particularly interesting in this regard is one, I've never met him, I'm afraid, Thomas Sudendorf, and he's German by origin, I believe, works in Australia. And his book is optimistically entitled The Gap. And what it is exploring this division between animals and humans. And it's a very even-handed and very interesting book indeed. And all the time there's a sort of leitmotif at the back of it, sort of saying, well, there shouldn't be a gap, but it keeps on reappearing. So there's something there which doesn't add up. But he's as far as I understand, a thoroughgoing naturalist. He's not trying to, smuggle anything in here. But the very word gap suggests that, again, he and a rather small number of people are intrigued in this sort of this question. So, as I also emphasised at somewhat greater length yesterday, and just to say a couple more things about it to go completely off-piste at last, is the question of the origin of language. And I don't doubt that our other panel members will shoot me down in flames in due course. I hope they will. That's what you're paid to do, old boy. Come on. But what seems to me is, in a certain sort of way, I mentioned Barfield, and I won't return to him in any direct way. And if you move away from the view that language is simply just sophisticated vocalizations which once grunted but then suddenly produced a verb, and in my own view, if you believe that, you'll believe anything, frankly, but that's perhaps a slightly different view. But I was meant to recheck before I left home. I've got the letters of C.S. Lewis, and somewhere in there, to a correspondent, and probably most of you will tell me the page number it was. Lewis had been able to do that. Oh, yeah, it's page number, something like that, because of his remarkable properties of recall, and that would take us off in another direction as to what memory actually is. But again, we better not get too diverted. But he mentions just as a thought whether, in fact, the gift of language was to two individuals called Adam and Eve. And of course, in the Genesis accounts, we know about the naming of the animals by Adam. And indeed, in a sense, that emphasizes not only our power to provide descriptions and recognize that a rhinoceros and a giraffe are both animals, but otherwise different, and therefore belong to different categories, something no animal can possibly do, in the same sense that mice know that cats are dangerous, but they don't give a toss whether it's a Persian or a Manx. It's irrelevant. They don't have that interest because they want to stay alive. They don't sit around, in the trauma surgery saying it was a Manx got me this time. And by this, what I'm trying to hint at is not for a moment do I want to espouse the possibility that there were two individuals called Adam and Eve. I'm not going down that literalist line. I've seen no need to do it because, of course, so as far as I can read the Genesis accounts, they are entirely mythopoeic. But it does seem to me that actually looking at it from that perspective of a gift, or at least something which is encountered, then accordingly one has the possibility of beginning to explain how it was that two people began to talk. Because after all, if language appears by genetic mutation in some chimpanzee Homo erectus cross, let us say 1 million years ago, but it's got absolutely nobody to talk to, then you can rest assured that is not going to be a successful evolutionary experiment. So I'll stop there because others have got more important things to say. But you'll understand here that we're dealing in part with the possibility of re-examining some aspects of evolutionary biology, which I may well be entirely incorrect, and that'd be absolutely fine because most of my life has been correcting previous errors. But also, as I emphasized, reminding ourselves that if you want to look at the world as a mythopoeic adventure, as Barfield and Lewis and even Williams in his own way did, then you may actually end up something which is far more fertile and far richer than a straightforward naturalistic explanation. So thank you in any case. Thanks.
Well, I want to thank the De Nicola Center for convening us, and I want to thank my colleagues and you folks. What a wonderful weekend it's been with conversation across the disciplines, within the context of a shared faith commitment, sharing ideas, and I would have to say just graciousness of exchange. It means a lot to me, especially since it calls to mind a very influential residency I spent here at Notre Dame some time back on a fellowship at the Center for Philosophy of Religion, which they perhaps unwisely extend to folks outside of philosophy. So it's good to be back. I also want to thank Simon for his talk last night, in which he invited us to consider what life on other planets might look like if it's there. And when I went home, I thought, well, life on other planets, what if we're not talking about other planets? How about altogether different universes? If there were different universes, where may some versions of ourselves existed? And I actually ran a little model, and here's one that I came up with. Okay. So I want to jump in. To the beginning and the middle of the last century, as the particulate and material aspects of Mendelian genetics emerged and discoveries of mutation were wedded with what appeared to be the teleological perspectives of natural selection and Darwinian theory, and we got what was called the modern synthesis. Along with that, a latent, you might call it a naturalism, nihilism began to emerge as well. This famous quote by, George Galen Simpson: "Man is the result of purposeless and natural processes that did not have him in mind. He was not planned." And along about that time, there were some countervailing voices that began to emerge. A really influential essay by Michael Polanyi in Science, Life, Irreducible Structure, argued that life, in fact, and this is in contrast to statements that Hegel made a century before, that there was no hierarchy of life. In fact, there was no actual distinction between life and non-life. And Polanyi wants to say, no, there is a hierarchical complexification of life and life's function. And the evolutionary sequence gains a new and deeper significance. We can recognize a strictly defined progression rising from the inanimate level to ever higher additional principles of life. This same view was echoed by the philosopher of biology, Hans Jonas, in his book, The Phenomenon of Life. And Jonas spoke of the ascent of souls. He says that the history of life shows a number of major innovations which mark the transition to new levels, entailing ascent or progress in evolution. Now, both Jonas and Polanyi were viewed as heterodox at the time, but not shortly thereafter they became maybe viewed as actually blasphemous, as views were galvanized that this view of any sort of purpose, progress, or directionality was excluded by evolution. And by the way, in both the popular and in the academic sphere. So it's a famous quote, popular book by Richard Dawkins: "The universe we observe has precisely the properties we would expect at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." Note, by the way, that although Dawkins is called one of the new atheists, he doesn't even mention God here. That's a given, that there's no God. And what really is lacking is any sort of purpose or moral realism. Alex Rosenberg, philosopher of biology, in a more thoughtful treatment in Biology and Philosophy, argues that Darwinism puts the capstone on denying there is any purpose, meaning, or purpose to the universe, its contents, and its cosmic history. So the title of the session is aptly framed. What we're really looking at here is the world that surrounds us and in which we have our being, a cosmos or a chaos. So I want to ask that question. Is there a warrant for thinking there's any kind of purpose? And I do need to begin with two quick distinctions. First of all, the word purpose itself means different things. I'm not going to do a philosophical analysis here, but just in common parlance, purpose can mean target seeking. Your thermostat or your hypothalamus has a temperature set point, It has a receptor to measure temperature. It has a control to decide whether the temperature is too warm or too hot, and then it has effectors to warm it up or cool it down. This is an active process that seeks direction, has a function that seeks a particular purpose. But then we can also say something has a purpose if it's purpose suited. It might not operate in any way. So here's a great example. A few years ago, my son, when he was about 4 years old, came back from the beach and he said, "Hey, Daddy, I found this rock. You could keep your pins in it." There's no thermostat, there's no functionality, there's no activity of this entity, but it's suited for a purpose. And that's what I want to focus on here. Now, by the second distinction I want to make is in confronting this, what appears to be emergent nihilism, there are a couple of different responses. One response might be to say, well, these entities look designed. It looks like there's an intelligence behind them. So, for example, I could find a pin holder that was purpose suited. It didn't have any operational activity, but it's designed. The design movement is doing this in two forms, looking at the endowments of the natural world that may look designed, or beyond the endowments, looking at the possibility of interventions in the natural world by a designer. I happen to be more sympathetic to the former than the latter, but I want to say a priori, there's no reason we can't ask either. But I do want to point out this. What design attributions attempt to do, and we might call them natural theology, right? Attempting to infer the existence or qualities of a creator from the creation. What they do is, and the metaphor often used is, if you found the New York phone book, you wouldn't think it emerged by accident. But here's what they don't do. If you have a book and you're sure it didn't emerge by accident, you never get as far as asking what's in the book. Is it a phone book? Is it Hitler's Mein Kampf? Or is it Romeo and Juliet? Design arguments don't ask what the plot of the story is. And similarly, more trivially, you could say a pencil holder was designed, but it would be oblivious to whatever qualities of the pencil holder might be conveying. It could be a joke. It could be Julius Caesar. It could be Deadpool or Darth Vader. I had some political ones here that I excised with pencils going in places that we don't usually imagine pencils going. So that's what I want to look at. And in fact, in contrast to design arguments, which are forms of natural theology inferring the existence or qualities of a creator from the creation, the approach I want to take here, and many of my colleagues, and it's interesting that I'm in Notre Dame, entails Al Plantinga's notion of Augustinian science or theistic science, which starts with a conviction of the existence of a creator and then asks, how might that expand our wellspring of hypotheses? And in fact, that's especially pertinent here, because if we consider purpose in the context of being purpose suited, it makes no sense to have something suited for a purpose unless you think there's an agent employing it for a purpose. So in this context, Richard Dawkins is right when he says, you're right to ask the why question of a bicycle's mud guards because an agent is using the bicycle, but you have no right to assume that the why question deserves an answer when posed about Mount Everest or the universe. Questions can simply be inappropriate, however heartfelt their framing. And I want to point out, this is from the same book that my first Dawkins quote came. I'll point out an ironic contradiction here. He says, by the way, I've asked a question, and the universe has no purpose. And then he says, and by the way, it doesn't make any sense to ask the question of whether the universe has a purpose. But in fact, if you start with the assumption of no being for which the universe might be employed to attain a purpose, Dawkins is right. So what I'm going to do here is not try to prove the existence of purpose, but if there were a being employing the universe to achieve his ends, I happen to believe there is, then what might we expect? So let's take a look. Is there a plot? And I'll just point out two things. First of all, there's the emergence of, over the last couple of decades, of notions of what are called major evolutionary transitions. I am not talking about big innovations like the nervous system or a skeleton or a movement from water to land. I'm talking about a series of thematically consistent and amplifying transitions. I'll give you examples. Aqueous mixture to a protocell. Prokaryotic to eukaryotic cells with organelles inside them. Single cells to multicells. Organisms that reproduce by themselves to sexual reproducers. Solitary to eusocial or social organisms. And then finally, I'm surprised to see this here, but primate to human sociality with symbolically and linguistically mediated information transfer. Now, all of these have in common not just cooperation, but cooperative interdependence. Can't get along without each other. Specialization and division of labor. Changes in information transition. And then, in some sense, a relinquishment of reproductive autonomy. And what this yields is an intensification of life's capacities. You have the emergence of the ability to control your temperature and to move and to see and to do everything that we think life does. Those things get amplified over the series of these transitions. It's a wonderful book called On the Origin of Autonomy, a new look at major transitions in evolution by Bernd Roislenbroek. And Dan McShay, a really prominent evolutionary biologist, has a paper on freedom and purpose in biology. And it's interesting to see McShay's transition, by the way. He started out as an agnostic on these issues and became progressively more persuaded that we have a real story going on here. Three quick things about this story. This Polanyi quote that I opened with is now back in vogue. So Ernst Murray, one of the architects of major transitions theory, says this progress, referring to Polanyi, is nowadays described as a series of major transitions in evolution. Secondly, the notion of these transitions, the driving force, so to speak, is cooperative interdependence. Not only is cooperation an outcome of evolutionary processes, but many of my colleagues in evolution think it's a driving force. So Richard Michaud says cooperation is now seen as a primary creative force behind greater levels of complexity and organization in biology. And thirdly, what about the question of human uniqueness? Well, folks are widely, we can talk about mental processes, but if you just look at human behavior, the scale of human cooperation eclipses that of any other species outside of kin-related or reciprocally related cooperation. But there's something more going on here. There's a debate over whether humans actually constitute a transition. I think both sides are right. On the one hand, humans are cooperatively interdependent, specialization of labor, and radical transformation of information transfer. On the other hand, we haven't completely relinquished reproductive autonomy. It's like we're stuck. And the Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson years ago said man has achieved an extraordinary degree of cooperation with little or no sacrifice of personal survival and reproduction. Exactly how he alone has been able to cross this pinnacle is the, get this, culminating mystery of all biology. Well, this is something that religious tradition, Christianity in particular, have thought about for years. So Pope's essay on man says, placed in this isthmus of a middle state, of being darkly wise and rudely great. And Pascal says man is neither angel nor brute. And the unfortunate thing is, here you think he's going to say, if you think you're an animal, a brute, you're going to act like one. No, he says the opposite. He who would act the angel acts the brute. If we don't understand our but dustness, we will never achieve the transcendence more than dustness. Two quickies and I'll close. This last thing, and this will be a talk in itself, the culminating mystery of all biology. Many of my colleagues are arguing that religion, in fact, is a crucial human adaptation that enables us to navigate the degree of prosociality that appears to be unique to human beings. No other than Dan Dennett says we have the desires to reproduce and to do pretty much whatever it takes to achieve this goal, but we also have creeds and the ability to transcend our genetic imperatives. This fact does make us different. Now I'm going to close by just saying what I'm not going to do for time. It turns out that all of these have sequential amplifications within transitions. Higher vision, higher homeostasis, longer lifespan, which makes investment in brains make sense over the course of learning. So within a transition, you still have further amplification. And I'll close with a quote again from Hans Jonas. Jonas says that last night we heard from Alistair McIntyre, who said that human beings don't have bodies, we are bodies. And Jonas wants to say it's our very bodies and the evolutionary trajectory that led to them that gives us greater variety and range of control over ourselves, that is to say, more freedom, and also more worlds, that is to say, range and differentiation of possible objects. By that he means the world that we encounter out there is more varied by virtue of our mental processes and our sensory apparatus than other species. And that gives us more selfness. Heaven forming each on the other to depend, a master or a servant or a friend, bids each on other for assistance call, till one man's weakness grows the strength of all, wants, frailties, passions closer still ally, the common interest or endear the tie. To these we owe true friendship, love sincere, each home-felt joy, life inherits here. That's the tradition, the transition to human community and the body of Christ. Thanks.
So which one do you want to go with?
It's the one that says symbol on it.
Symbolic.
There you go. This is my advancer?
Yes.
Okay.
So just forward and back.
Got it. Thank you all. We're coming to the end of an incredible group of conversations that we've had. I had two talks prepared, and I've decided on this one. We can wander back and forth, I suspect, afterwards. But since we've been talking a lot about human uniqueness and about sudden transitions, this is an area that I've been pursuing in my career for, I would say, 40 years now. And what I want to talk about is what I call human symbolic nature. And this is, I think, very directly in response to what Simon was talking about, but also as we ended just a few minutes ago with Jeffrey, that it's really about a sudden transition. Why are we doing what we're doing? Why are we so unusual? Can you imagine this room filled with chimpanzees? No. And listening to me talk and being quiet, come on. So what's so unusual about us? I've pursued this as a neuroscientist, and I want to talk a little bit about the neuroscience, but mostly about something that we take for granted that we don't realize how unusual it actually is. And this has to do with our symbolic abilities. And I think this phrase, the word becoming flesh, actually is our story. Our story is that our flesh is the result of the word to some extent. So what I want to do is I want to deepen how you think about what words are, what communication is, because we have lots of kinds of communication, and not all of it is like language. In fact, we take language for granted, but it's the rare, weird exception. One species in the history of evolution communicates this way. One species can do it. We can, with great, great effort, try to get some other species to get close, but we hardly do. But there's two other modes of communication that are everywhere in the natural world. One is iconic. That is, in which something carries a form that's similar to something else, and it brings that something else to mind. This is quite common, and of course it's used for all sorts of purposes, not because the moth wants to look like eyes, but rather that having wings that look a little bit like eyes when it's surprised and flips open might chase off a predator, for example. But icons don't necessarily need to be just something that shows up in the natural world. We have conventional icons, and my favorite one, of course, is the smiley face here winking back at you. But we also learn by traces. Insects communicate by traces. Ants follow tracks because they've laid down chemical traces and so on. And of course, a footprint, classic example, in this case on the moon instead of Friday leaving it on the beach of an island, nevertheless gives us information about something that we don't see. It's not just that it brings to mind another form, it brings to mind something that's not actually there. So a windsock, similarly, if you had no experience with this, sitting inside of a room, looking out the window, looking at this, you would recognize that to some extent the windsock is giving you information. It's communicating to you about the strength and direction of the wind. Why? Well, because you have some familiarity with clothes being blown in the wind and so on. These are modes of communication that are not like language, even though language uses some of these. On the other hand, language, which we describe as symbolic, and I want to be clear that the term symbolic is way overused, so I'm going to use it in a very narrow sense to talk about the kind of thing that language involves. The key here is that symbols are ungrounded. By grounded, what I mean is that the sign vehicle, if it's a likeness, carries something in it that's like what it refers to. A sign vehicle like a footprint carries a form that is the result of a physical connection with something else. Notice that none of the words I'm saying have those features. They're not physically connected with things, and they're not like the things I'm talking about. As a result, this is difficult. How could you possibly acquire this? How could any animal species acquire a mode of communication that is not grounded, completely ungrounded? One of the reasons that it's so rare in the world, why there's one species after billions of years that's begun to do this, is it's not a trivial problem. We're familiar with how these relate to each other. Think about the ring, the signet ring. What we see is that there's a likeness there in terms of the shape. There's a physical contiguity, a connectedness, the indexicality of it being impressed in the soft wax. You know that it was physically in contact. Signing a piece of paper, which I did a little earlier today, similarly, you know that I had to be there with the paper, and that somehow that's special. All of evidentiary law is based upon this kind of, yes, it was physically connected somehow. But in fact, the signet ring to seal an envelope or to seal a missive of some kind is there also because of a social convention. Nothing you can see about this. You have to know something about the society. You have to know something about the habits of people. Something that's not visible, it's not contained in this experience, it's not there. You need to know it outside of it. And that's the problem with symbols. And what this tells us is that we know this from experience, but we do it so easily as human beings that we don't pay attention to it. To acquire this as children, and also to have acquired it in evolution, there had to be many steps in which that iconic part and the indexical part, pointing and likenesses and sharing, have to be there to build this up. Symbolic communication requires many, many steps in order to literally pull the ladder up after ourselves. So we can use this, but once we have it, of course, there's incredible capacities available. I'm going to go quickly through the next couple of slides because I don't have time to tell you about all the nervous system stuff that's behind this. Our nervous systems have been changed by this. And they've been changed by it because we have been evolving for, I think, a couple of million years in a symbolic niche. a niche that's been created, not an environment of physical stuff, but a niche in which knowing symbolic communication has played a major role. Why do I have a picture of a beaver dam here? Because beavers have built a niche that their bodies have adapted to. We have built a niche that our nervous systems have adapted to. We are symbolic species, which is the title of a book that I wrote some years ago. That is, we're symbolic species the way dolphins are aquatic species, defined by the niche that we've adapted to. That didn't work. Let me see here. There we go. I'm not going to talk too much about the nervous system, except to say that one of the things that we're beginning to find out is that, number one, there are no new parts. We have bigger brains with more neurons, but no new kinds of parts compared to chimpanzees. When I first encountered this in my early research, it was a stunning finding. I expected to look into the brains of other species and say, this is unique. Okay, now I know why language is possible. No, it's not. It's actually quite subtle. And over the last few decades, struggling to figure this out, what we found out is that they're tweaks. The tweaks are pretty minor. That is, there are parts that have gotten a little larger, parts that have gotten smaller, parts that make connections that didn't make them before, but they're not huge. The fact that I'm able to vocalize like I am now is something that no other land mammal can do. Precisely because there's a connection that links the motor cortex of my brain to this nucleus that controls my larynx. That's new, and it's there in part because as the brain got larger, those connections competed for that area. It was a subtle, subtle process. We call this evo-devo, the linkage between evolution and development. Unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about it, but we are beginning to understand some of these features. And I'm going to zoom through some of these just so we don't get stuck. Let me stop here for a second. Some of my colleagues have been working on using fMRI, this new technique that's been around now for a couple of decades, to study language. One of the things that we've been discovering that's a real surprise is almost the entire cerebral cortex is involved. Even though every part evolved to do something else in other species, they've been also recruited to do this. This is a map of words. Why? Because each of the words was part of something that the patient was listening to and was recorded, and it turns out that different parts of the brain are involved in it. If you're hearing about something about vision, visual areas get involved. If you're listening to something about fighting, areas involved in emotionality get involved, and so on and so forth. The entire cerebral cortex, almost, not quite. As you can see, a couple of dark areas, not too many, seems to be involved. Rather than tell you about how this happened, because I think we now have a reasonable sense of how it happened, it's because the word, language, symbols, the problem of communicating this way had to change brains. As brains began to use this process, they became modified by it. The word is becoming flesh. It took about 2 million years. But what I want to talk about next is that to make those changes, other things had to change as well. And so what I want to say is that the consequences of these changes are not just linguistic. It's not just that we're talking primates. Everything has changed. And I think Simon was giving us a sense of those differences. I want to give you a few more. This is one of my favorite books. It's by a Berkeley publisher. It's called Why Cats Paint. Now, you might think that that's kind of a joke. The last part of the book is about cat sculptures. I happen to have a couple of cats, and I tell you, my furniture is a great indication of cat sculptures. But the real question, of course, is why cats don't paint, and why we do. I think part of it, let me do a little neuroscience here, is because those areas of the brain that produce emotionality are not fundamentally different than we find in cats, in monkeys, in dogs, even in mice, surprisingly. But what we do find is the ability to communicate with an ungrounded form of communication allows us to juxtapose things in interesting and troublesome ways. And that activates the nervous system in interesting combinations that are just inconceivable combinations compared to other species. So I like to think about this as the two sides of the brain are oftentimes in interaction and in competition with each other, two different emotions juxtaposed, and so on. don't go through and read this whole thing here, but what I'm interested in is the fact that one of the things about the displacement of language, displacement of symbols from the real world, is that it allows these interesting juxtapositions that can activate our emotions. So at the bottom I list what I call emergent emotions, emotions that are very unlikely to be found, if ever, in other species. Why? Because we've activated these parts of the brain in complicated ways. My favorite, of course, is nostalgia. Think about the complexity of nostalgia and what kind of an emotion it is. It's a very distinctive emotion. It's not an emotion that's likely to be experienced by other species, in part because we're capable of doing this. Let me give you a couple of examples before I close here. And here's three different images. Each image is an icon to some extent. It brings something to mind. Maybe some experiences you've had. A mother and a baby. We've talked a lot about babies this time around. Children playing with toys. And here's a toy on the right, a little marionette. My favorite source of what I'm about to show you next is the New Yorker magazine. On the left is a cover of the New Yorker magazine. Look closely at it, spend a moment sort of staring at it. What's going on in this? Now, actually, the question I want to ask is, what's it about? What does it mean? Isn't that what comes to mind? What's being communicated here? Well, there's a puppet and a baby, and the baby's having fun, and oh, the puppet is a mother. You know, we don't just look at the surface of this. As soon as we see the oddity of it, we look through it. We want to know the meaning of it. We want to see beyond it. This is the nature of symbols. Symbols stand out here, but there's something beyond them. That's what we want. What symbols have given us is this thirst to know what's behind it, what's beyond it, what produced it. The one on the right also came out, as you might suspect, after Sandy Hook, in which one of the suggestions is, well, maybe we should just give, kids weapons or give the teachers weapons or whatever. This juxtaposition, it immediately it communicates to you, but it doesn't just communicate what's on the surface. It doesn't communicate just what the correlation is. It communicates a meaning. We overuse the term meaning, but meaning is very characteristically and uniquely symbolic in this sense, even though I can do it in pictures. Here's a way to think about that baby picture. And it's sometimes been called a conceptual blend. It's what language allows us to do, to blend things together in interesting ways. But notice that this is a blend that's done with icons and indices. The different parts of the picture point to each other. They're indices, and they have icons in them. And they just have a kind of dissonance. But notice that it's not just a cognitive, not just a mental dissonance. It's also an emotional dissonance, because each of these images comes with a little emotional tone. And when they're not exactly aligned, that emotional tone comes across as well. What we're doing when we communicate symbolically is changing all aspects of how our nervous system works. Before I end, I want to talk about just a couple of unusual things we take for granted that are really unusual. Now, I'm not going to try to teach you any neuroscience here, except to say that memory is easily taken apart into two parts. One of them has to do with a kind of memory that involves skill learning. When I learn to type, eventually I stop thinking about where my fingers are. Skill learning works by virtue of redundancy, doing it again and again and again and again. We oftentimes think about it sort of like as a river runs down a hill, it carves deeper and deeper and deeper channels, and it becomes more and more automatic. But notice that redundancy as a way of establishing memory doesn't work if I ask you, what were you doing on your birthday last year? That happened once. It didn't happen a lot of times. We have to have a memory that actually is able to construct past information on one-off occasions. How do we do it? Rather than redundancy of repetition, it's redundancy of associations. And totally separate parts of the brain are involved in this. We have two kinds of memory characteristic of all mammals. They work the same in us as in other mammals, but there is a special case here. Because in us, When we learn language, learn this random set of sounds linked together, we learn it as a skill. I don't have to think about it anymore. But what it does is it cues associations. Language has allowed us to use one kind of memory system to cue the other one, which then cues the first one, cues the next one. What's the result of this? Story, narrative. What I'm doing now, trying to explain something. Every one of us has a story about our life. Every one of us has a story about our society, our community, our history, my beliefs. We're capable of doing this because we have used memory in a phenomenally unique way. No other species does this. We live in stories. We live in narratives. In fact, walking around town, most people are not talking to each other. They're not worried about what's going on. They're living some narrative as they walk to lunch or worry about what they're going to tell their employers next, when they go back after lunch. We have this unique use of memory, and that has given us a very, very powerful tool. Finally, and this is probably the most important thing, we can do something that no other species can possibly do. Simon hinted at this with his wave goodbye. We're spending most of our lives inside of each other's thoughts. We're capable of telling each other what happened last night, what happened last week, why my childhood was a mess, what I plan to do next week, what I desire for my future, for my kids, for the civilization, for the world. We're in each other's heads. No other species is like this. Language, precisely because it's pulled the ladder up, because it's no longer linked by virtue of these iconic and indexical features, allows us to represent things completely abstractly. But that means we can also represent things that we couldn't possibly gain access to. What's going on in somebody else's head? We are all living in what Teilhard de Chardin called a noosphere. We're living in a world in which we are living in a world of shared thought. And we hold each other responsible for the shared thoughts. We hold each other responsible for the changes in feeling that my behavior might cause. Why? Because we are now forced to be in each other. We're part of each other. In fact, Aristotle is part of me in this respect. It expands history. It expands all over the globe. That's a unique feature. Some people have called this theory of mind. It's much more serious than that. We are a species that I like to say we are symbolically eusocial. That is, we can't do without each other. We can't think without language. And we can't acquire language unless we're in a world surrounded by others who are doing it as well. But as soon as that happens, huge, huge changes are possible. Here's a couple of other pictures. Just look at these before I end. I won't try to tell you about them. The one on the left, American Puzzle. And the one on the right, interestingly enough, happened just after 9/11. Just take it in. I won't try to tell you anything about it. But basically, we're all asking ourselves, what do they mean? Why did they produce these funny things? What's being told here? And each one of us will have a slightly different story, maybe. Maybe see things that others don't see. See that this guy on the right, where the curtains are open, is actually exactly what was missing in New York. And yet, where is he? He's just cutting up his drapes. And he's living out in the country. And he's got a magazine open that he's looking at. Very complicated story here. There's a story here. We construct this story. So here's what I want to say. What was in that apple? It was knowledge of good and evil. It was the knowledge of we're in each other's heads. It was Adam and Eve being embarrassed that they know what the other person sees of them and have to cover up. They're getting in each other's heads. This powerful, powerful tool that we human beings alone have acquired has radically changed the world. And it will continue to radically change the world. Maybe change what the human species actually is. Thank you. Almost.
So those are very, very compelling descriptions of where these basic molecules have extended through across time. I'd like to just open it up to each other to probe a little further. And then I have a couple of questions I want to ask, and then we'll throw it out to the audience in the last few minutes. But anything to ask each other?
Shall I start?
Yeah.
By starting now, I won't have to say anything else from now on. And you younger people remember this tip, when you get to my age. Just a couple of observations, and I hope they're constructive. With Jeff's thing, I think, if I may say so with respect, it mentioned a whole lot of things I should have been much more familiar with, and I saw nothing to quarrel with, obviously. But I think it'd be fair to say that if our dear friend Richard was here, Richard Dawkins, that is, and in fact, I should say that, whatever you may feel about the chap, he is an utterly dedicated naturalist. He is so enthusiastic about this area of life. So although he tends to be a hate figure in some areas, he's not a chap to be neglected at all. I mean, I don't agree with what he says mostly, but, it's not quite the point. But the point is, I think that description you provided us with was, could be put completely, and this is not a criticism, but it could be put entirely and completely within a naturalistic framework.
Yes.
And so we really don't have anything else. I mean, the implications may well be there. There may even be an elephant of some dimensions in that room, which we want to try and find. But we need to remind ourselves that, we probably have to look, as we both be very willing to do, behind that as well. And then very briefly to Terence as well, this business about the brain and everything else, this may or may not be relevant to this sort of discussion, but there's several things I've been reading about quite recently, and they may well fall easily into the way in which you depicted words being effectively suffusing the entire cortex. And related to this are, for instance, and you're the expert in this area, but there are examples of the excision of major areas of brain tissue, sometimes even the removal of an entire hemisphere. And when the person comes round from the operation, nothing's changed. They're functioning perfectly normally. And that's also echoed in these very strange cases, by no means all of them, of hydrocephaly and so forth, whereby the amount of brain tissue has been dramatically reduced, and large areas of expanded ventricles full of fluid. And yet in some cases, the person's behaviour and indeed mathematical ability in one famous case are entirely unimpaired. Now, we can see and explain that from a naturalistic viewpoint, and in one sense we have to, because blow me down, the brain's still there and it must be doing something. But another area I came across, which I find deeply fascinating and actually alludes slightly to the question of memory, and it may be if the conversation opens out, which I hope it does, with regard to memory, is, to the best of my knowledge, these facts are true. I'm a British citizen, I'm in the United States, and it is to do with what's called terminal lucidity. And this is a phenomenon which probably many of you are aware of, that amongst the many disgusting ways in which you can leave your life is to have a protracted episodes of Alzheimer's. And this is degrading in all respects and dehumanizing and horrible. And it's to be avoided. But unfortunately for many of us it won't be. But the point is that towards the end of people's lives, and indeed it is an indication, I understand, that the death is within a week or two, nearly all their mental faculties return. Now, I find this extraordinary, and again, I'm not trying to import some sort of mystical explanation. It merely seems to me that, as and when we deal with the normal functioning brain, or indeed the backdrop of evolutionary biology, there are these elephants in the room, and I don't have any explanation for terminal lucidity or indeed these hydrocephaly. But these are comments, and they're not in any way meant to be destructive, because what Terence says I found absolutely fascinating, once again told me next to nothing. Let me just finish with a quick story, and I hope I've got this one right as well, because often, especially in a Darwinian context, one equates things like, for instance, building a dam as a beaver and symbolism. And of course, that one is particularly striking because we can sort of see a proto-technology there. And it's impressive because, you know, they are engineering the ecosystem. But I learn, I hope I've got these facts right, and the work was actually done rather improbably in Sweden, but there we go, that actually how does the beaver know how to stop building the dam? There's presumably some genetic component which says that it's a good idea to chew down trees and stick them in a stream, and thereby create a lake and all the things which go with the construction of the dam and so forth. And it turns out that actually what controls the behavior of the beaver is the sound of running water. So, you know, when the water's running, they sort of rush around saying, we better stop the water running. And they're not aware, you know, of sort of Yangtze Gorge project in front of them. But then corresponding, as soon as they stop hearing the water, they stop building. And that's, again, from a naturalistic viewpoint, is precisely what you'd expect. And, you know, we take our hats off to the beavers. We also take our hats off to the Swedish investigators.
Well, who used a speaker to produce the sound of, they used a speaker to produce the sound of running water, and the beavers kept piling things on it.
I just want to make a quick response and thank you, Simon, for pointing out, and boy, I hope this was clear myself, that the world I was describing through a series of major evolutionary transitions and then didn't quite get to describing of amplifications within transitions is imminently achievable by natural processes. Christians have been divided on this. Some want to develop an account of nature that requires supernatural intervention. And the example I gave was a text. But it seems to me from both scientifically, but also theologically, the most crucial question is, what does the text say? Is there a plot? And in particular, is the world that we see around us, however it was created, not demonstrative of, but concordant with the kind of world that one might assume, or which the scriptures say was amenable to achieving the purposes of a wise and loving creator? I think it is. I think when you just look at the world, but I don't think that demonstrates the existence of God, and I don't think it requires the intervention of God.
I see you're passing it on to me without warning me. I think, let's see if I can make this work here. There we go. Very good. The point of my presentation here was obviously not theological. It was, as you mentioned, Simon, an entirely naturalistic account. But what I wanted to get at is why one species on the planet is interested in meaning. Why do we look beyond the surface of things? Why can't we not do that? I like to sometimes describe us as symbolic savants. We can't help but do this. This is in our very nature. It's in our nature because it had to be there, because our nervous systems had to accomplish this very difficult task of transferring to a kind of communication that was radically unlike any kind of communication in the rest of the animal world. That's a major transition. I think everything about what we're doing here is about meaning. But here's the issue. What's in front of us doesn't necessarily tell us for sure what the meaning is. That's the challenge. We've been struggling with that challenge for millennia. We will probably continue to struggle for millennia with it. It's, I think, interestingly enough for me to know why we do that. Is this something divine? Is it telling us something about the nature of the cosmos, the nature of evolution? I don't know for sure. But what I do know is that it's transformed us. we are already living in the noosphere. We are already, in some sense, transcendent beyond what the rest of life is doing because of this. Precisely because we can transcend our own thoughts and be part of a larger thought community.
I got a question for you. I got a question for Terry. First of all, I want to express appreciation. I need to think more, but I love your comment about nostalgia, being addicted to it myself. So here's the question. As you go through these series of evolutionary transitions that I mentioned, at each stage you have cooperative interdependence. You also have the possibility of defection. As individuals relinquish some degree of autonomy to the collective, there can be others who retain it. So in multicellular organisms, the defecting cell is called cancer. And in social species, we can do the same. I love your notion that we live in a that we are symbolically eusocial. What do the defectors look like in a symbolically eusocial species? What are the risks there?
It's a great question because we're all struggling with it in this country today. And we're struggling with an augmentation of the communication system that amplifies those possibilities, makes it possible for the defectors to have massive control. But think about, just think about nuclear weapons, for example. What it's done is it's made it possible for a few individuals to actually threaten the world. The fact that rather than the collective doing this, rather than you might call a social intelligence that's distributed, that we're all a part of. Instead, we've created a technology that's allowing small individuals to modify the entire collection. The only way this happens in the natural world is when the larger collective has more power than the individual defector. In the animal world, we sometimes call this reverse dominance. That is, when one individual in the population is troubling the population or the social group, if the rest of the social group collectively can now have enough power to suppress that. We do that with policing, or we sometimes call it pro-social behavior, and so on. We do that a lot. The key here is that technology has somewhat upset that. And I think it's one of the challenges that we face. Technology has probably also increased the power of the noosphere, precisely because now I can know what people in Germany, in Australia, in South Africa are thinking and doing in a second. And we just haven't figured out how to amplify that in a positive way, but that's our challenge.
So let me ask a question, and then we'll put it out to the audience, and we can go a little over 4:30 because this is the last session. We want to be attentive if people want to go to Mass. But Simon last night described, first, the night before, we heard about the thin blue line. Then last night we heard about the conditions within that thin blue line that seemed propitious for life, for the development of all this extraordinary unfolding and the capacities that seem so unintuitive if you just look at everything from a molecular perspective. And it was pretty obvious, listening to Simon, that it was not just the physical conditions that shaped the evolutionary process, but what he calls molecular inherencies, the very properties of the molecules out of which life was made. And as you look across the span of life, the succession of transitions that Jeff referred to and that Terry elaborated, they make a certain sense in the looked at from the perspective of increasing scope of freedom of operation and power over the world, and that's just amazing, and it raises for me two very fundamental questions, and let me put those two fundamental questions in a larger frame. So here we are with these powers. You referenced nuclear war. Well, maybe we can get through Ukraine and stop that. But even if we do, we've got the much more subtle powers of our slowly operating, subtly operating biotechnologies that sneak in one at a time, altering our lives in ways we're barely aware of, and changing the basic substrate of our individual and social collective nature. The question then is, what? It's twofold. Was this all in the cards? Was this all going to happen? Is it all because of the nature of the core principles and elements within which this drama is unfolding? Was this going to happen? And if there were exactly the same conditions, would it happen on another planet? We'd heard about the rewinding of the tape with Stephen Jay Gould, and Simon seemed to say, no, that's not necessarily true, that we'd get a different outcome. Is there an alpha in this? And then the next question is, what is the omega? How is it that life was able to make the choices at every moment? It had to make certain choices, what kind of enzymes to develop, what kind of interactions between cells, and it made the core choices that kept the future open for the extension into these extraordinary realms that we witness right here in this room. So is there a cosmic plan and purpose behind all this? Is it in the core created principles in which it operates? And what are the conditions of the future as we go forward? Jeff referenced Hans Jonas. Hans Jonas also described the evolutionary process as a progressive scale of freedom and peril. So just give us a little comment about the beginnings, the source, and the destination of all this, each of you, and then we'll ask a couple questions before we break. Simon, you start.
Sorry, I almost promised not to talk again. I think very succinctly, without revealing all my cards, yes, I think, that in a sense, it was all going to be like it is from the beginning. And indeed, the privilege of being a scientist or a historian is that one can investigate this in some degree of detail and satisfaction as well. And by this, I do not mean that we're in some, sort of, as Alistair McIntyre was discussing in a way which I found interesting, that the whole universe is entirely deterministic, and that's another bag of discussions. But even so, the potentialities are there the whole time. What I would say, and this is my conclusion, is that as ever, we remain astonished and surprised, and the future we would like to think that we can predict it and have some clue as to what's going to happen next. And as Terence mentioned in brief about the sort of intercommunications, and God help us, the internet, which I have very dark views of indeed, but I'm still optimistic in that thing. But we should be fully prepared to be not astonished at what we know, but to be open always to the most surprising things. And in fact, I alluded very briefly to a certain episode in AD 33, which did come as a bit of shock to some people. Mm-hmm.
Simon often talks about convergence. I think of convergence as you're sitting playing a bingo game, and the same numbers keep coming up. I think, and I don't think Simon would be resistant to this, in addition to convergence, you could also be in a bingo game and a series of numbers could come up that was ascending. And I think that is the case in evolution. I don't think it's totally by accident. Some of those transitions I mentioned, like the first protocell and the symbiotic origin, are viewed as being very unlikely. Others, the transition to multicell, the transition for sexual reproduction have occurred over and over. But the bottom line for me is I do think if we replayed the tape, we would get something like human beings capable of thoughtful reflection, communication, and most importantly, yielding their lives on behalf of one another. Here's what I wrestle with. So I think humans, I think all living creatures have a nature. They have a telos. Aristotle spoke of perversity as behavior that was antithetical to one's nature. And I think humans are the only creatures who are capable of perversity. And the question, the reason why I don't think merely running the tape forward is going to get us to ultimate fulfillment and consummation is because of that capacity to choose against our own flourishing and fulfillment. As a Christian, that's where I believe grace comes in, that we need deliverance. And my one last question is, well, did God himself foresee this need? And here's where I guess I would disagree with Alistair McIntyre in terms of not knowing, although individual human decisions may be singularities, I think that capacity to choose perversity, the fact that we do choose it, the fact that we need deliverance, and the fact that God committed to providing it existed before the very creation itself.
I don't have too much to add. What I would say is that whenever this issue comes up, I revert back to the following quip. History does not necessarily repeat itself, but it often rhymes. and I think that that's what we're going to look for. Getting back to McIntyre's point about singularity, I do think human beings represent a singularity, precisely because we've pulled the ladder up after ourselves in some respect. That means we have cut off something. We don't know. We don't have direct communication with the world as much. Our thoughts have allowed us to transcend the world, but have also allowed us to be severed from the world. And the two are, the double-edged sword, so to speak. And for that reason, it's an open-ended question where we're going. Let's hope it rhymes in a way that we appreciate.
Well said.
So we have time for a couple of questions. Yes.
Yeah, I was hoping to put
Can you take a mic because we want to?
Oh, yeah.
Hi, Jason Baxter. I was hoping to put especially Terrence and Simon in conversation. Terrence, you gave a great description of all the kind of neurological mechanisms which are needed to make these distinct symbolic operations. And as if in order to get to language, what we needed language as the final teleological end for these operations to happen. But that kind of creates a little bit of a problem, doesn't it? I mean, we need language in order for the brain to know what it needs to develop into to create language. So I was hoping you just kind of talk about that problem. And then, Simon, if you have any thoughts about how Barfield could come to our aid here. Barfield seems to want to go, the opposite direction rather than a reductivism, and emergent properties as sort of a final end begins first. I'm just thinking of metaphors in Barfield. I mean, take something like, he meditates on attention. Right, we use that word, and from Latin, it comes from ad tendo, right? As if you're taking a stretchy band and pulling it towards something, and when it latches on, it pulls back into itself. But Barfield says it's not as if in this physical phenomenon we discovered this spiritual and mental property, right? And then a spiritual concept emerged out of a physical one, but rather it's because we had something like a spiritual property in which we reached out and felt each other in participatory mode, that we then looked around in the physical world for physical metaphors to describe what we were thinking. But in some sense, one is kind of, emerging out of, and one is kind of retroactively going backwards. So I was hoping you could talk to us about how do you develop a brain to get language if you need language first? And if Barfield kind of has something interesting to say in this problem.
Let me start with what I think is the simple answer. And that is, of course, it doesn't start with language like we have. It has to start much, much simpler. There is a story to be told about this. It requires a little bit of comparative animal behavior, a considerable amount of discussion of the context of human evolution over the last 2 million years. But what it basically, it's an answer that every evolutionary biologist would give to the chicken and egg problem. That the adult and the embryo both emerged slowly, and they've differentiated. One of the things about life that's different than engineering is that living things are not put together by parts. You don't just add language to something. It differentiates from something much less organized. As our embryos begin unorganized and then internally differentiate. Evolution basically works this way as well. That is, things that are not specific, not precise, become much more articulate. We probably weren't able to speak until about 500,000 years ago, simply because of the connections to the larynx that were not really well developed. And we can make pretty good guesses about this, knowing now what the genes involved were and what the changes in the brain were. But we were communicating symbolically in lots of ways, as we do today also. Think about every ritual we engage in, from marriage to funerals. We don't need a lot of words always to do this. Oftentimes, actions play that role. We act. When I say I do, that's an action. It's not just symbolic as well. So it's a complicated story. And I'll give it to Simon to go to the next step.
Well, thank you as best I can. I mean, to be vicious and Cambridge Donish with regard to Barfield, I say, well, just go and read Barfield. don't ask his agent here to. But that would be an unkind reply. Partly because Barfield himself is intensely complex and not always easy to understand. But in large part, I think it's because he is dealing with territory which nearly everybody is totally unfamiliar with. And ironically, in a sense, you have to relearn your language if you're going to understand Barfield. It's not exactly a helpful thing to say. But I would gently disagree, I think, with Terry. I mean, he's much more familiar with the details of hominin evolution, and there's been a lot of discussion about this as to the early tools, going back to pre-Oldowan days. But there is an argument to be made that these things are not the same as chimpanzee lithics, and that there is clearly some exchange of information. Now, this could be done, if you like, in a sort of show and tell method, but my own sense is you're going to have language to do that. And I'm also unpersuaded that the language would necessarily be any simpler. It would be ecologically relevant to the places they live in, to be beyond that. You know, watch out, that's a bloody leopard, would come in useful quite early on, I think. But the whole point about Barfield is that his view of what language is and where it comes from is radically orthogonal to any naturalistic explanation. And it segues very much into what, as I mentioned last night, Tolkien's view of language, and also Lewis's view of the universe and the myths and so forth, and these sort of areas here. And it's quite difficult to summarize, but in a way, I mean, Terry's going to find he's actually agreeing with me now, though he doesn't yet know that. But the point here is that with complete fairness, he emphasizes our particular uniqueness and peculiarities. And we agree that it's a matter of language. And thereby we would sometimes diverge in various sorts of ways. But what Barfield is doing is saying, in part, as I mentioned briefly last night, that the consciousness, even I think in medieval times, is not the same as our consciousness today. And it's not simply a fact that they thought the sun might be going in some other sort of direction, anything to do with that, nor their restricted geographical, though in fact that's greatly exaggerated. Medieval people were going all over the Mediterranean. English people were going regularly to Jerusalem. You know, it was part of what they did. But the aspects there is that they had particular words. And again, because you have to be so careful when you're reading an ancient document, and you, not you personally, obviously, but you think that word means the same as it does today. And of course, this happens in Shakespeare quite a lot as well. It doesn't. So that business of parachuting yourself back into this other world, once you start to do that, then in fact your whole understanding is enormously enriched. And of course, Lewis had this view that he was not interested in the least about the character of the poet. What he wanted to know is what the poem was saying. Because as he said, it meant that I could now look at the world not through just my eyes, but 1,000 eyes. And that, in a sense, is resonating with exactly what I think Terry is saying, that, one has completely new world, and therefore
when we now see this extraordinary impoverishment of our language and the reliance on very short set of words put together. They're called, I believe, can somebody correct me here? Are they called a tweet? Is that right?
Yeah.
Thank you. Very helpful. Thank you very much. I don't touch any of this stuff at all. So I'm not answering your question usefully, but any of you who are interested in this area, I highly recommend Barfield's stuff. He's also wrote some very interesting novels, one of which is slightly echoes E.M. Forster's The Machine Stops. And those two are well worth reading. I've been rambling on for too long, and I think everybody needs a drink. I certainly do, as usual. But yes, what I would encourage you to do is that with the Oxford Inklings in particular, and Charles Williams in a particularly fascinating way, actually you are allowed to throw all sorts of ideas which pass for received wisdom and chuck them out of the window. You really are allowed to rethink things, and you shouldn't be frightened of doing this, because the orthodoxies of today are stifling.
Can I make a very quick PS? We have been talking about the uniqueness of language, symbolism, the rational manipulation of symbols and concepts, which, well, since the Renaissance has been viewed as distinctly human, since Aristotle, actually. But many of my colleagues in evolutionary biology these days and behavioral ecology are focusing in on something else. There are phrases that are appearing in the literature that I would have never guessed, referring to humans as, quote unquote, a spectacular evolutionary anomaly, or a radical evolutionary outlier. And these phrases are applied not to human cognition or language, but simply to human prosocial behavior. The extent to which we invest ourselves in the lives of others appears discordant with what we see in any other species. Now, it may be that language helps facilitate that, but I don't want to lose track of the fact that in one sense, what many of my secular colleagues are observing makes humans unique is this radical capacity for love.
We'll have one more question.
Oh, yes, I think to follow up on that, and this also bears on Terry's point. I have a certain unease when I hear what I call single-part evolutionary stories. I don't think you're trying to tell that, but I think to me the question of language needs to be seen much more holistically. I mean, we're embodied creatures, and when this comes in, and how it relates to our upright posture, how it relates to what Plessner calls eccentric positionality, seems to me that we need to think about these things in a more holistic way and just can't take one particular trait. And I think that was your point, Jeffrey, as well, is that people can begin to emphasize behavior, we can begin to emphasize face-to-face communication, reading of the hands and so forth. It seems to me all of that becomes so remarkably displayed in the human appearance. And so maybe you just have some comment on that. Yeah. Maybe you weren't telling a single-part story. But.
So I was telling a single-part story, in part because I had 15 minutes. Yeah. I do teach courses that last for a year on this topic. I've saved you from that. But it is definitely the case. The story with stone tools. I think the real challenge in this is that we're talking about a time frame that we have no way to think about. Talking about, I believe, from my own research, that this is a process that's been going on for over 2 million years. Just even try to imagine it. To imagine a million people is hard enough, but this kind of time frame, this is not a time frame in which our ability to tell stories works. Because there were thousands and thousands of little stories. And distributed over thousands and thousands of individuals with many aspects, stone tools, upright posture, loss of body hair, a whole range of things that are involved in this process. And then, of course, the fact that we had multiple migrations out of Africa into Asia, into Central Asia, and dating back to 1.8 million years, leaving Africa and literally walking to Java in the low sea level. Some remarkable things have happened in this. It's a huge history. To fully understand it, of course, is an extraordinary puzzle, and I appreciate that you asked it that way.
I think we better close. so that everybody go to Mass. But just as a closing comment, Terry made it very, very beautifully portrayed how we went from words to symbols to narratives, and that theme actually ran through everybody's comments. And in his book, Simon, that I described last night, Simon makes a very trenchant and beautiful comment that through this process, we didn't just write our own story, invent our own story, but we discovered the story we are part of. And Jeff made reference to that a minute ago. We're now very swallowed up in this physical descriptive story from the natural sciences, but there's a larger story operating here. And we've got to, as Simon said, rethink, allow ourselves to rethink and think beyond, to reintegrate the findings of our science with our deeper intuitions and revelations of our human experience. And so that story is one that we're discovering, that we're part of. And Jeff made reference to that story and reference to it as love, as the fulfillment of that story. When we look forward toward the future with the increasing tools of our freedom, we would be wise to remember, as C.S. Lewis said, that we should answer all of our problems, all of our challenges with more love, not less love. Thank you very much.